Welcome to this simSchool Teach Aloud. In this episode, we'll be teaching Metropolis Elementary School, a diverse 12-student class, and one that you may encounter in tutorial modules, classroom management modules, and other classes that you might teach in simSchool. Sometimes classes do reoccur, but we may be teaching them looking through a different lens each time. One time we may be teaching a class thinking about classroom management, another time we may be looking at cognition and emotion or social and emotional learning, so you may encounter this class of students multiple times. When I open a simSchool simulation, what I always make sure that I do is read the overview and instructions, and then I scan any of the resource files that are here for me. If there's a lesson plan that I'm expected to implement, and how I implement that lesson plan is really fundamental to teaching this class, it will always be here for me as a resource, as well as on the resources page. Now, there may be other times that I encounter a class where there's a specific theme, perhaps it's a special group of learners, and implementing a specific lesson plan isn't as important. It's more the way that I'm relating to the students. But if that lesson plan is important, it's always going to be here for me. I can click on the lesson plan. I can get an idea of what the tasks are and think through how I might sequence and pace this class on my own when I start teaching. And I can download this and I can print it too if I want to. So that's something that I'll often do. The next thing that I'll do is I'll make sure that there aren't any additional resources on the resources page that I might want to take a look at. In this class, they're exactly the same. And then I'll go open up my teaching class. Now you'll notice in this particular class, I'm going back and I'm teaching class 1 again. I've already taught the other classes and I've looked at an observation report. That's what turns the blue star into a green check mark, is when I've taught the class for the required amount of time, I've gone to observations, and I've actually built a report. So I'm reteaching this class. And we're going to go ahead and start it together. And it's normal for the first time that I teach a class in a day, it's normal for it to take a few extra seconds for it to load. When I come back and teach this class again, it will be much faster because some of the information is stored on my local computer. Now, the teaching overview that I see is exactly what I would see on the overview and instructions. Now, teaching objectives, this is important for me to take a look at because this lets me know what's going to appear on my observation report when I finish teaching. So I should definitely scan this and take note of the particular ways in which I'm going to be observed. And now I'll start teaching. My students automatically enter the classroom. And as they do, notice that I had already been teaching this class for 11 minutes and 38 seconds. At any point, I can navigate away from simSchool. I can leave this browser. I can go click on overview and instructions. And I don't necessarily have to always remember to hit the pause button because simSchool will auto pause it for me if I navigate away. But I know that in teaching this class, I realized some things that were more successful for this class that I hadn't observed before. I'm actually going to restart it, which I can always do. And I don't lose my teaching time. I just get a chance to begin from scratch again. simSchool is always keeping track of all my time, and I'll show you what that looks like on the observations page. Now, what I noticed in teaching this class before, and while we're letting that reload, I'm actually going to click on the observations to show you. This has been a particularly difficult class for me to teach. The students are really prone to raising their hands a lot, and you'll notice when you look at my record over time that my academic gains were much lower than my emotional gains. Now, this doesn't mean that I did a bad job. I had students that were improving. But for me, the question is, can I get it higher than that? And I actually had a real surprise teaching this particular class in a different module where my academic and my emotional gains were upwards of 83 to 90%. And I was shocked because I've taught this class so many times in focusing on classroom management. And what I learned is that I wasn't giving the students enough time to move between tasks. I was giving them too much to think about too quickly. And so I'm going to start this class over again and show you a couple of the things that I realized worked really well for this particular class. And all of this, of course, is experimentation. It wouldn't be reasonable to expect that you're going to spend 4 or 5 hours teaching each of these individual classes, but it may be reasonable for you to teach the first class for 15 minutes. Realize that there's something that you might want to do differently and go back and teach it again. When your instructors are able to download a full report for a module that they've completed, it's really class 5 that they're looking at granular data for, and they're looking for change over time. So what they want to see is that, okay, if that first class that you taught, you had 0% effectiveness, it's okay, it's the first time you taught that class. But how are you doing by the time you got to the fifth class? If you were upwards of 40 to 60%, that's average and more than fine. Anything above 60%, between 60% and 80% is very good. Above 80% is outstanding teaching. For myself, if I'm lower than 40% effectiveness, either emotionally or in academic gains or behavioral gains for my students, by the time I get to the fifth class, that's an indication for me that there's probably something that I can work on, and I might want to go back and teach it again. It's always possible in every simulation that you'll teach to get in the 40 to 60% range for academic and behavioral gains for your students. So again, the question for you is this the best that I feel like I'm able to do with this group of students, with this seating arrangement, and with the lesson plans and the resources that I have? And that's for you to decide. But now that I taught this in another module, I know that I'm able to get above 80%. So I'll show you what I learned. Now these are elementary school students. What I found is that I was having them move through things far too quickly. I was moving at too fast a pace. So I'm going to start first with a classroom routine, a classroom management routine, and I'm going to greet the students. Now, depending on the nature of the students and their personalities, sometimes they'll say hello back to you, sometimes they won't. These guys are looking a little bit shy, and that's perfectly normal. The next thing that I found that was really successful for them is I gave them a chance to work on their breathing for 5 minutes, which is a really good self-regulation technique, actually with all ages of students, and particularly with young students, to let them breathe, to let them doodle, to give them time to transition between tasks. And I'll tell you, it was a real surprise for me. This student, James over here, he's one that usually needs a lot of a relationship with you. He may raise his hand pretty frequently. And I found that by greeting and giving them transition time, giving them the time to work on breathing, he's not raising his hand nearly as much for the rest of the class. So that's something I'd really like to encourage you. Don't forget to explore those things. So it's only been a minute. And what I found in looking at my data across the other classes that I had taught is that for myself, I was starting to get a little bit antsy. So I would get to a minute and I would want to jump on giving them something else to do. But the fact is I'm asking them to work on their breathing. So I'm going to take a breath and I'm going to do the same thing. And what I can always do is just check in with them. And I can say, how are you doing? In a really friendly way. They're working on their breathing. I don't think that's going to distract from that. They're probably all going to say fine. Or they're breathing and they may not. They'll all say fine. That's okay. It's fine. That's okay if they all say the same thing. They'll oftentimes also say really different things too. So all I'm doing is I'm letting them breathe. I'm not rushing them. I'm going to go up and I'm actually going to use a nonverbal cue and just smile at the class. Again, I'm not expecting anything of them right now. And before, when I've taught this class, I really was. I would get to about the 2-minute mark and it would be my instinct to really jump into instructional tasks. And then I found that this is actually a really successful strategy for these students. I need to give them room and not feel like I need to fill every second of the class. Now, at any point, I can come up here and check on progress. And know that when you're looking at academic and you see low performing and middle performing, for something like this, that's really in direct relationship to what we've just asked them to be working on. I'm having them work on breathing. So there's nothing academically for them to do. So the system is just saying, well, yeah, nobody is gaining anything academically right now. So don't panic if you see students in this low performing category. You're not asking anything of them. And with these indicators, with the progress indicators, if they move from high performing to middle to low, don't think of that as the students are failing. Think about it that there's been a decrease in their performance. And then the question becomes, can we help them move back up again? So when I go look at behavior, when I see bad behavior, again, think of it more as engagement or disengagement. My students, I see some smiles here. I see Gracie is not terribly happy. I see a couple of other students that maybe aren't necessarily thrilled with working on their breathing right now, but that's okay. They're not being disruptive. They're not turned sideways in their seats. So don't think about this as disruptive behavior. Just think of it as a decrease in their engagement overall. And that's okay. I'm not worried about that. So let's see. We're at about the 2-minute mark. What I found in an earlier class that I taught is they actually did really well if I gave them a chance to work on their breathing for 3 or 4 minutes. For the purpose of this demonstration, this Teach Aloud that we're doing, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to move them forward. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to go into instruction, and I'm going to say, let's draw a picture. And it's okay, you've got that lesson plan. Look at the lesson plan, see the things that you think are in it, how you would sequence them. This is the order in which they appear in that lesson plan, but you may choose to jump around based on what you think is going to be the most successful for your students. And I found that this starting the day by greeting a class member was actually a little bit challenging for some of these students, and it might be because some of them are very shy and others are low language proficiency. So asking them to start the class by speaking out loud to another classmate, I think was maybe a bit too high of an expectation for them right when the class started. So I found that they were more successful when I asked them to draw a picture of something that they did yesterday. None of these students have mobility challenges, so that's something that they're able to do. Let's give them a second to get out their paper and pencil. Okay, and I see a lot of smiling faces. And what I found earlier is that didn't happen when I launched right in to having them talk to other students, when I didn't greet them, when I didn't give them a chance to do a self-regulation task first. All of a sudden I gave them anything to do and half the room the hands went up. And that can be really overwhelming. But also notice when they do put their hands up right away, don't feel like you have to instantly start clicking on every student. It would be impossible and really stressful to do that in a real classroom. It's no more realistic in a simSchool classroom. So I don't know if you noticed, but right away, James and Felix's hands went up. Well, think of them as being friends. Felix really feeds on James. So if James starts saying things like, I'm bored, or can I do something else? You will hear an echo from across the room in Felix. Now is a good time for me to click around the room, see how the students are performing. Felix is working. And I know this from these little progress indicators. I learned that when I went through some of the earlier tutorials. Terrence is done. He's smiling. He's happy. Robert is done. Gracie is done, but she's got such a sad expression on her face. Their expressions really do matter. So I'm just going to check in with Gracie. I'm going to make a verbal comment, and I'm just going to ask her how she's doing in a really warm tone. Now, what simSchool does for your convenience is the last comment that you made, it preserves that in case you want to make that same comment to another student or to a group. Particularly if you've typed in a custom comment, it's going to keep it for you so you can use it again, but you can always type in a different one or make a different selection. I'm just going to ask her how she's doing. I'm going to say it to Gracie. And what I found when I was teaching earlier, she's probably gonna tell me she's fine. I found that when I did that, just that check-in with her, there, see? She just needed a little bit of a check-in. And now I know that this young man, because I've worked with him quite a bit, Michael, he's very capable. He's also very methodical. He's a bit of a perfectionist. So he works on things a little bit more slowly. And notice everyone around him, I've got a lot of smiles. I can tell you they're done because I've done this before, and Michael's working slowly. So I don't want to rush him. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to say to the class, I'm just going to make a really positive comment. These are young students. So I almost feel like there's no harm in really praising them. And it's something that you find on your observation rubric too. So I'm going to tell the whole class, you're doing really well. They're engaged. I had them draw a picture. Thank you. Okay, so everybody is thanking me. What I've also found is when I do things like that, okay, sometimes they'll do this, you prod them a little bit, and then they'll go back and they'll work on things a little bit more. So they were done, but I told them I was proud of them, and now they're going back and they're working more, which is fine. That's not a system error. You may find that happens in a real classroom too, that the students have become a little bit disengaged after a couple minutes, but you say, hey, I really like what you're doing, and then they'll go back and work on it a little bit more. So by doing that, couple of my students, I saw Felix is drawing a little bit more, even though he's done, he's working on it some more. And I can see that Michael was frowning and he's not frowning anymore. He's smiling and he's still working. So I'm going to go up and I'm going to check on Michael's profile. Now, normally in a simSchool simulation, I would have paused right when I started and I would have looked at all the student profiles. I know that you saw that in the tutorial materials, so I'm just kind of assuming that that's something that is good practice. That at any point you can pause. You can look at their profiles. It's really important, and that does show up on that observation rubric at the end. This is one of the ways that simSchool says, okay, is the teacher that's teaching this class using the available data to make adjustments to understand what students need? This is one of the ways that it's looking at you being able to access student data. So make sure that you check the profiles. So I'm looking at Michael, and I can see he's getting really close to done. I don't want to move anybody on. I can also see, this was about that point that I told everybody I was proud of him and I didn't rush him. And he's doing really well. He's actually performing a little bit higher than the average for the class. So that's great, in particular because when I look at his scores, he's strong in art. In other ways, he's a very average student. So I'm glad that I'm giving him time to do that. And the thing is when I stop and actually think about the time that we've spent in this class so far, it's 8 minutes. That may feel like a really long time in the simulation, but the characters are aware of time. So if you rush them, if you ask them to do things too quickly, if you make comments to them in rapid succession, they will have a hard time responding to that, and you may see lower gains for yourself at the end when you go look at your observations. If this was a real classroom, I would have given them a few minutes to work on their breathing. I would have given them maybe 5 or 6 minutes to work on drawing a picture. So the fact that we're 8 minutes into this class and that we haven't gotten into any really specific instructional tasks yet, I don't think is a problem because it matches the goal of this particular class. We're going to be working on social stories. I want to get the kids used to the idea of what a social story is by way of giving them a chance to self-regulate, draw pictures, and then we'll work on things together. Okay, so I see Michael's pretty satisfied. He's done. No questions. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to move on to the next thing in the lesson plan. And notice I skipped over this first thing. And remember I told you that's because I've tried it before. And for this particular group of students, I felt like that was a hard thing to do right at the beginning of the class period. But I might come back and I might revisit that later. That might be a way that I close out the class period. Is instead by saying, I might type it in. Instead of choosing this from the instruction menu, I might say, okay, students, as we're ending the class, turn to one of your classmates and tell them about something that you learned today. And that's something I could type in on my own if I wanted to in the talk menu. Next, I'm going to move on to this next task because I feel like it was already scaffolded a little bit. They had a chance to draw a picture. So now I'm telling them, I'm going to be showing you something on the board. I expect their eye focus to be faced forward, and you can look at their eyes. So if you look at them, James kind of likes to look off into space sometimes. Okay, Gracie looks a little bit bored. I can see that some of my other students, their eyes are in the direction that I expect their eyes to be if I'm doing something at the front of the room. So that's really what I'm monitoring right now. Are the students responding? If I ask them to speak to each other, if I ask them to create something, whether it's to draw, write an answer to something, if I'm doing something that's lecture-based, I'm explaining something to them and I expect them to be able to listen to me and watch, are they able to do that? If they're struggling with that, that's on me to try to figure out why that is. Like I can see Felix has really kind of been looking off to the side. And so I'm curious, I'm going to go look at Felix's profile. So now I see that he's done, meaning really he's gotten everything that he's able to get out of listening to me give instructions. I can also see when I look at his profile, okay, listening is actually a strength for him. He's a very good student. So frankly, this probably wasn't very challenging for him. So when you see this real dip in academic performance, sometimes that can happen actually when you have a very capable student and they're disengaged, or you're not asking them to do something that's at the level that they're capable of. Like when I look at this class, I could see it at the beginning of the class period where Felix started. He's really bright. So I'm just not challenging him very much right now, but it's okay. I needed to give instructions. That was something that needed to be done for the lesson plan. The fact that he's declined, I'm not going to stress about right now. He's not upset, but I do kind of want to keep an eye on it because he wasn't really plugged into what we were doing, so I want to watch it. Now I already know Gracie is very sensitive, and so she has a tendency to, and she's also very shy. She won't raise her hand and ask for help. So she is one that I might want to check in later with and just say, hey, Gracie, how are you doing? So in this way, that is how I navigate that lesson plan. I looked at it before the class started. I thought, what are the things I want to try to move this class through? Now, I have to teach for 15 minutes to get an observation report, but I have found in teaching this class for multiple times These students are much more likely to learn and do well with the tasks that are in this lesson plan if I give them space between, if I give them a chance to doodle when the class period starts, if I give them a chance to breathe, if I give them a bit of transitional time between activities. They are far higher performing when I do that. So for me, I have found that to get through that lesson plan and teach this class, I need to teach for about 20 minutes. And that's a successful teaching experience for me. Yours might be very different. You may do really well in teaching for 15 minutes. And so I'm just telling you some of the things that I experienced. It's very unusual for every student in the class to raise their hand. If that happens, it's probably an indication for you that, oh, okay, I might have moved too fast, or I might have skipped over something. They might need extra scaffolding. Don't be afraid to restart the simulation, because when every student raises their hands, it would be so rare for that to happen in a real classroom, and it's rare for it to happen in simSchool. But I'll tell you, I've had that happen in this class, and I learned because it was actually, I was moving too fast. I wasn't giving them really room to get used to the tasks and settle into them before we moved on. So we've been at this for about 15 minutes since we started, and 13 minutes of teaching time. I hope that this was useful. Remember, when you start teaching a class in simSchool, particularly the first time that you teach them, it's no different than the first time that you walk into a classroom of live students and you've never met them before. Don't expect for yourself that that's going to be the best representation of how you're able to work with that class. Give yourself a chance to get to know them, with the goal that by the time you get to that 5th time of teaching the class, it really is the best representation of how you are able to implement this lesson plan in a way that's going to be the most successful for this group of students. And always remember, if you have any questions, at any time you can scroll to the bottom of simSchool, you can submit a support email, and we'll get back to you as quickly as we can and answer any questions that you have. So good luck, have fun teaching, and definitely make sure to use the resources that are available to you and to really get to know your students.